Hello and welcome to my channel. If you enjoy the repetition of crochet and the scary story, then you have come to the right channel, and I believe that you are going to enjoy it. Today we are going to tell a story about a cemetery in Chicago. It is titled The Resurrection Apparition. In 1976, police rushed to Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois, to see if reports were true that a pale woman in white was trapped inside after closing. By the time they arrived, she was gone, but her handprints remained burned into the bars. The specter may have been the elusive Resurrection Mary, the phantom hitchhiker who has appeared to motorists for more than 60 years along the road that passes the cemetery. This is Homer out at Resurrection. So what's the deal, Sergeant? Was anyone locked inside the cemetery? Not necessarily. Is there anyone there at all? Not exactly. Well, what is it exactly? The story that Police Sergeant Pat Homer told back at the station led to one of the most bizarre tales in Chicagoland ghost lore, and its aftermath still resonates to this day. It started out simply enough, a non-emergency call to the Justice, Illinois precinct the night of August 10th, 1976. A man called from a payphone and wished to remain anonymous. Driving north on Archer Avenue. On his way to Summit, he had glanced over as he passed the entrance to Resurrection Cemetery. To his surprise, a blonde woman dressed in a long white dress was standing inside the main gates, her hands clutching two of the bars. She was trying to get out, or so it appeared. The motorist wasn't sure. He told the police he'd been in a hurry, and it wasn't until he had gotten several miles down the road that he began to worry about the stranger. The graveyard should have been locked at that hour, shouldn't it? What if she was actually trapped inside, or in some kind of danger? He felt he had to let someone know. What he didn't admit to the patrolman was that he was too scared to drive up to the front entrance. He'd heard too many stories about the phantom hitchhikers haunting Archer Avenue. He didn't want to run into any spirits. When Homer took the call, his first thought was that some kids had jumped the gate and were spotted after having vandalized the cemetery. But he had to admit it was possible that someone had gotten stuck inside after visiting hours. The iron bars around the graveyard, especially those between the pillars at the front, were very high, and it would be difficult for anyone, especially a woman in an ankle-length dress, to skinny up and over them, unless she was a ghost, Homer chuckled to himself. According to legend, sometime around 1935, the wraith of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed lady began showing up at night outside the Justice, thumbing on Archer Avenue. The earliest tales had the young woman asking to be taken to O. Henry Dance Hall, which was 3 miles to the southwest in Willow Springs. By the 1970s, the dance hall had been renamed the Willowbrook Ballroom. If a driver wasn't courteous enough to stop for her, the Banshee was known to jump on the car's running board. Ah, running board. Those were the days, thought Homer. Or, more frighteningly, she might dash out into the street in front of an oncoming car to try to flag it down. More than one motorist claimed that his car passed right through the girl as if she were made of ether. Still, others admitted that they thought they'd run her over. They'd heard and felt the collision, but when they stopped to help the victim, she was gone. Sightings tapered off in the 1960s, but the most recent ones had the mysterious hitchhiker traveling in the other direction, away from Willowbrook. In most of those reports, the driver had seen the damsel in distress on the side of the road and stopped to pick her up. Others said they'd been dancing with the girl all night in the ballroom and offered her a ride home. Regardless of how she got in the car, she gave the Good Samaritan little information, except that her name was Mary and she was heading home, a little past Justice. During the trip, she'd enter a private, peaceful solitude. Then, as with many ghost stories, the tale has a dozen variations. Usually, as the car passed Resurrection Cemetery, Mary would visibly dematerialize or simply disappear. In others, she would become very agitated and insist that the car pull over. She would fling open the door and rush up the short driveway toward the graveyard. Just as she reached the entrance, she would evaporate into thin air. Sometimes, after she vanished, the driver would see her one last time, walking noiselessly toward her grave on the other side of the gates. The other side of the gates? Homer slammed on the brakes. That part of the old wives' tale and the report he was currently investigating had too much in common for it to be a coincidence. He had been set up, sent on a wild goose chase. Well, he was less than a mile away from the cemetery. In case it wasn't a prank, Homer knew he had to check the place out. One way or the other, he'd know soon enough. It was a slow Tuesday night, so the road was fairly empty. He'd be there in less than a minute. In many tellings of the Resurrection Mary legend, she became a specter after being hit by a car as she walked home from the ballroom. She had set out on her own after being jilted by a lover. In other versions of the tale, the car she was riding in crashed, and she was fatally injured. After the funeral, her parents buried her in Resurrection Cemetery, wearing a long white gown and the very dancing shoes she had on when she died. Somewhere along the way, people began to think that the apparition Mary was a Mary Bregovy, whose grave could be found in Resurrection Cemetery. But in reality, their similarities end with the first name and gender. Bregovy died in an auto accident in downtown Chicago and looked nothing like the spectral hitchhiker. Nevertheless, many believers in the paranormal insist that the two women are one and the same. Well, people can convince themselves of anything, thought Homer as he pulled up in front of the graveyard. If they hear about this wild goose chase I'm on, the next thing you know, they'll say it was Resurrection Mary who was standing here at the gate. He opened the engine, leaving his high beams on. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. He stopped the engine, leaving his high beams on to illuminate the scene. Just as he suspected, there was no one around. In fact, the place was deathly quiet. He stepped out of the squad car to take a closer look. Although the midsummer heat had burned off for the night, it was still quite humid, with barely a breeze moving in the evening air. As he walked to the fence, Homer slowly ran his flashlight from one side of the wide entrance to the other. The tall iron bars, a deterrent to anyone who wanted to break into the burial ground after hours, were standing there like silent sentries, completely undisturbed. Or were they? Homer focused his light on the centermost bars in the gate. It wasn't possible. About 4 feet from the ground at waist level, 2 of the bars were bent. One was moved just slightly out of whack, but the other had a definite curve to it. And more incredibly, both bars had a series of indentations, spaced just a few inches apart, pressed into the weathered light bluish green patina. They were fingerprints. I'm going to back up and read that paragraph one more time. And more incredibly, both bars had a series of indentations, spaced just a few inches apart, pressed into the weathered light bluish green patina. They were fingerprints. It was as if some unknown person or entity had grabbed the bars with both hands and then, with incredible strength, separated them enough to be able to force himself, herself, itself between them. Shaken, Homer made his way back to the police car. He took a few moments to collect his thoughts, then called in to report. After a few more minutes staring at the mangled fence in stunned bewilderment, he started up the motor and headed back to the station. Nothing more could be done until morning. The next day, Homer drove out to the graveyard and sought out the caretaker to find out what had happened to the fence. The explanation was simple. He was told a maintenance truck had accidentally backed into the bars, causing them to bend. Exact duplicates couldn't be found, so the authorities had wired a welder to use a torch to straighten them out. For the first time, Homer noticed several black horizontal lines, scorch marks, on each of the bars. In the darkness the night before, they hadn't been visible. But what caused the grooves that look like fingers? Well, that's exactly what they were. Sort of, the groundskeeper admitted. After the workman got the bars to the correct temperature, he used his own hands, safely covered with asbestos gloves, to try to move the bars back into place. Unfortunately, he wasn't successful, but the iron had become soft enough to pick up the impression of the man's fingers. Sergeant Homer and the rest of his staff were satisfied, but they didn't count on the story taking on a life of its own. You see, the police weren't the only ones to discover the oddity. Word rapidly spread in the ghost hunter community, and soon curious spectators were coming to see the anomaly for themselves. Almost immediately, there were debunkers to the cemetery's account. How could a truck have damaged only 2 bars in the middle of a row without disturbing any of the others? Even with fire-retardant gloves, who could have withstood touching, much less grabbing hold of, a glowing white-hot iron bar? The surface temperature would have been almost 500 degrees. No, something very unusual had happened at Resurrection Cemetery, an honest-to-goodness supernatural occurrence. The debate went on for weeks. Then the Cemetery Association, anxious to get the controversy behind them, made the absolute worst decision possible. Without warning, they removed the mangled bars and put 2 new ones in its place. And so the conspiracy theories began. What was the cemetery board hiding? Why was it afraid to let people see the bars for themselves? The answer was obvious. Otherworldly hands had warped them, but the cemetery didn't want anyone to know. After enough people protested, the bowed bars were reinstalled. Over the years, hundreds of photos of them have been taken. Many have been posted on the internet, and a quick web search will turn up enough pictures to pique anyone's interest. But were Resurrection Mary and the spirit who showed up inside the graveyard gates back in 1986 one and the same? Perhaps some night a solitary motorist will pick up a stranded traveler on that lonely stretch of Archer Avenue and ask. Chicago folklore is filled with stories about ghosts on the roadways, and Resurrection Mary is not the only one to set up camp outside a cemetery. An unidentified, bloody apparition has startled motorists by rushing frantically out into the traffic on the streets surrounding Bethania Cemetery. 3 roads border the graveyard. Its other eastern boundary is Resurrection Cemetery. Another spirit haunts Bethania Cemetery. An elderly maintenance man who usually spotted burning a pile of leaves. If the spectator turns away briefly, then looks back to the groundskeeper, both he and the fire are gone. The street that passes by Evergreen Cemetery, just 9 miles away in Evergreen Park, is also haunted by a spectral hitchhiker. Appearances by the young female phantom, who looks to be about 14 years old, began in the 1980s. The weirdest part of the tale is that she doesn't always wait to be offered a ride. On at least one occasion, she hopped aboard a Chicago Transit Authority bus headed toward downtown. But apparently, she doesn't carry a lot of pocket change. When the driver asked for the fare, the girl evaporated right before his eyes. And finally, the story of Resurrection Mary brings to the mind the legend of a yet another similar spirit that also manifests just outside the Windy City. The girl who predates Mary is always dressed as a 1920s flapper. She appears on the highway between the 2400 block of DePlaine Avenue in DePlaine, where the Melody Hill Ballroom used to stand, and Harlem Avenue in North Riverside, where the Jewish Waldheim Cemetery is located. Like Mary, the young woman tries to get Midnight Lives home from a dance hall, even though Melody Hill is long gone, only to vanish near a cemetery's gates. The girl was first seen with some frequency in 1933. Sightings waned during the war years, but she came back with a vengeance in 1973. She hasn't been around for some time, so keep your eyes peeled. She's overdue for a comeback. If you enjoyed the story today, hit that like button. And please subscribe to my channel. I do upload regularly. I do enjoy a bit of a scary story. It's always the paranormal that gets me thinking. So I do enjoy scary stories and scary movies. Always have. So if you have a scary story that you would like me to tell, put it in the comments below and I'll make sure that I get that done for you. Until then, stay scared, everyone. Bye.